In 2020, Egypt's president looked directly into a camera and said, "No one can touch Ethiopia's share of the Nile water, but also no one can touch Egypt's share." Then he paused. All options are open. That is a nuclear-armed country telling another country that going to war over a dam is on the table. This is that dam, and this is that story. The Nile River is not just a river, it is the reason Egypt exists. For 7,000 years since the very beginning of recorded human civilization, Egypt has been built around the Nile. Its agriculture, its cities, its entire population of 106 million people concentrated in a ribbon of green land on either side of the river. Step off that ribbon in any direction, and you are in the Sahara Desert. Egypt has no other water source, no meaningful rainfall, no aquifers large enough to matter. The Nile is not important to Egypt. The Nile is Egypt. And here is the geopolitical fact that makes everything that follows make sense. 85% of the Nile's water does not come from Egypt. It comes from Ethiopia. Specifically from the Ethiopian highlands, where the Blue Nile originates at Lake Tana and rushes north and west, carrying the snowmelt and monsoon rains of the Ethiopian mountains down into Sudan and then into Egypt. For centuries, Egypt controlled the Nile politically because it was the most powerful state in the region. In 1929 and again in 1959, colonial-era treaties gave Egypt the right to veto any upstream construction that could affect Nile flow. Ethiopia was not consulted on either treaty. Ethiopia never signed either treaty. Ethiopia, for most of its modern history, simply on April 2, 2011, Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles Zenawi stood at a bend in the Blue Nile River, 40 kilometers from the Sudanese border, and announced that construction would begin immediately on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The GERD. The numbers were staggering from the start. A concrete dam, 1,780 meters wide, 155 meters tall, creating a reservoir covering 1,874 square kilometers, an artificial lake larger than the entire country of Luxembourg. 6,000 megawatts of electricity generating capacity, the largest hydroelectric dam on the entire African continent. More than double the electricity generating capacity Ethiopia had at that moment. And Ethiopia needed it desperately. In 2011, 65% of Ethiopians had no access to electricity whatsoever. Hospitals ran on generators, schools had no lights. Industrial development was impossible without reliable power. A country of 110 million people, one of the largest populations in Africa, was running on almost nothing. The dam was not a vanity project. It was not a geopolitical weapon. It was a survival decision. The Ethiopian government funded part of the construction through an extraordinary act of national solidarity, selling Renaissance Dam bonds to its own citizens. Ethiopian workers, farmers, civil servants, people earning almost nothing voluntarily contributed portions of their salaries to fund the dam's construction. They called it their dam. The People's Dam. The Renaissance Dam. Construction began within weeks of the announcement, with Chinese and Ethiopian engineering teams breaking ground simultaneously at both ends of the dam wall. Egypt watched and said nothing publicly. For exactly 3 weeks. Then, Egypt exploded. In June 2013, 2 years into construction, an Egyptian television station accidentally broadcast what was supposed to be a private government meeting. Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi sat with senior political advisors discussing the dam. The options they discussed on live television, broadcast across Africa, included funding Ethiopian rebel groups to destabilize the country from within, conducting covert sabotage operations against the dam's construction infrastructure, and stated plainly, without diplomatic language, airstrikes on the dam itself. The Egyptian Air Force had recently acquired F-16 fighter jets from the United States. Military analysts immediately calculated whether those jets had the range to reach the dam site from Egyptian air bases. They did. With aerial refueling. Ethiopia's response was immediate and ice-cold. Prime Minister Hailemariam Desalegn went on national television and said, "No force can stop Ethiopia from building the Renaissance Dam. Not today, not ever." Construction did not slow down. It accelerated. Sudan, the country between Ethiopia and Egypt, through which the Nile also flows, sided with Ethiopia. Sudan would benefit enormously from the dam, reduced flooding, regulated water flow, and the possibility of purchasing cheap Ethiopian electricity. Egypt now faced the scenario of being the only downstream country opposing the project. The Arab League held emergency sessions. The African Union attempted to mediate. The United Nations watched nervously as two significant African military powers moved toward what looked increasingly like open conflict over water. Because what was happening in the Blue Nile Gorge was not just a construction project. It was the first time in history that an upstream African nation had the capability and the will to unilaterally alter the flow of water that a downstream nation depended on for its survival. It was a preview of what water wars in the 21st century would look like, and it was only getting started. Between 2013 and 2020, there were dozens of rounds of negotiations between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. The Declaration of Principles, signed in 2015, seemed like a breakthrough. All three countries agreed on the basic framework. Ethiopia had the right to build the dam. Egypt had the right to be protected from significant harm to its water supply, and the three nations would cooperate on technical studies to determine safe filling rates. It meant almost nothing in practice, because the core disagreement was not technical. It was existential. Egypt's position was clear. The dam's reservoir must be filled slowly, over 12 to 21 years, allowing the Nile's flow to Egypt to remain near normal levels throughout. And in drought years when the Blue Nile ran low, Ethiopia must release water from the reservoir to protect Egypt's supply. Ethiopia's position was equally clear. It would fill the dam as fast as engineering safely allowed, targeting 4 to 7 years. And it would not commit to releasing water during droughts, because that water was needed to generate the electricity its population had already gone without for generations. Both positions were completely reasonable from each country's perspective. They were completely incompatible with each other. In 2019, the United States entered the negotiations at Egypt's request. The Trump administration hosted talks in Washington. For a brief moment, it appeared a deal was close. Then the US published a draft agreement, without Ethiopia's approval, that sided heavily with Egypt's position on filling rates and drought release obligations.